The Andrea Doria Shipwreck is a treasured diving site for many divers, as many of them desire to dive into the one-time luxurious Italian ship. The allure of the shipwreck, such as its china, has enticed various divers. Is China's recovery worth risking one's life? This is the story of Richard Roost's exploration of the Andrea Doria wreck site. Andrea Doria is a once-upon-a-time Italian-line ocean liner home-ported in Genoa, Italy. She was launched on June 16, 1951, and had her first maiden voyage on January 14, 1953. The ship was named after a Genoese admiral, Andrea Doria, who was a Prince of Melfi. He played an important role in the Republic of Genoa during the 16th century. The ship's total registered tonnage was 29,100, and it could board about 1,200 passengers and 500 crew members. The Andrea Doria was the biggest, fastest, and supposedly safest of all the ships in Italy. On Tuesday, July 17, 1956, Andrea Doria was scheduled to begin a trip from Genoa to New York City, across the Atlantic. The ship had 1,134 passengers, all berthed in the first class, cabin class, and tourist class section of the ship. And with them are the 572 crew members, making a total of 1,706 aboard for this voyage. Andrea Doria started boarding at about 8 a.m. on July 17, 1956, at the dock in Genoa, where she took her first batch of passengers before departing at 11 a.m. She made her first port of call at Cannes, which is on the French Riviera. Before noon on July 25, 1956, 8 days after the Andrea Doria departed, the 524-foot Swedish passenger liner Stockholm, commanded by Captain Harry Gunnar Nordenson, left New York dock for her home port of Gothenburg for her eastbound crossing on the Atlantic. She was almost booked to capacity. Stockholm is about half the size of Andrea Doria. She followed her usual course, taking the southern route of the Nantucket Lightship at a speed of about 18 knots. Stockholm was set 20 miles north of the eastbound course recommended for ships leaving the U.S. This means that the ship was sailing straight into incoming westward traffic. Stockholm violated the 1953 North Atlantic Track Agreement, which Swedish-American lines had signed an agreement with. Stockholm and Andrea Doria kept approaching each other. Andrea Doria had been sailing in the heavy fog for hours, and now, with a reduced speed from 23 to 21.8 knots, the ship's foghorn was activated to notify incoming ships. But Stockholm had not entered the edge of the fog bank and wasn't aware of the incoming Andrea Doria that was hidden in the fog. As they kept approaching, the two ships became aware of each other's presence. They were only guided by the radar. There was no initial radio communication between them. The collision occurred as a result of this misinterpretation. They were both coming closer to each other instead of widening passing distance. The thick fog made visual contact nearly impossible for the two ships. At the time they would make contact, they were too close, and a collision was inevitable between them. Before they could maneuver their way, the two ships collided, and Stockholm struck the side of Andrea Doria at about 11:10 p.m. When the collision occurred, the two ships sent out radio distress calls, which were received by many radio and Coast Guard stations. Andrea Doria began to sink at about 9:45 a.m., and Andrea Doria finally sank at 10:09 a.m. on July 26, 1956. The rescue was one of the largest in maritime history and lasted for several hours. As a result of the collision, 51 people had died, 5 on Stockholm and 46 on the Doria. Stockholm was built with a strong ice-breaking bow because it usually sailed very close to the Arctic Ocean. This was one of the main reasons she survived the accident and caused catastrophic damage to the Andrea Doria liner. Andrea Doria became a treasured dive site for many divers because of the luxury of the wreck. The divers used their explorations to add feathers to their caps. Many went to the Andrea Doria shipwreck to recover the valuables left in it, such as the auxiliary bell, the china cups and saucers, and many others. The top of the wreck was initially 160 feet of water. 1 week after Andrea Doria sank, two divers, Peter Gimbel and Joseph Gox, strived to locate the wreck of the Andrea Doria and published the pictures they took when they found it. In 1968, the first Italian expedition to the Andrea Doria shipwreck was done by A.I. Giddings, Bruno Vailotti, Stefano Carletti, Mimi Dias, and Arnaldo Matteo, who produced a documentary from their expedition. A bronze plaque was used to mark the wreck with this inscription: "We came here to work, to make the dream come true and return the Andrea Doria to the light." Evelyn Bartram Dudas was the first woman to dive into the Andrea Doria in 1967, and she recovered the ship's compass. Many divers who made their way into Andrea Doria include Steve Belinda, John Chatterton, Gary Gentile, Gary Gilligan, Richie Kohler, John Matters, and Richard Roost. Andrea Doria is mostly referred to as the Mount Everest of scuba diving. This shipwreck diving site was compared to Mount Everest after the diving expedition of Captain Alvin Golden in July 1983. During an interview by CBS News televised of divers' experiences after returning from Andrea Doria shipwreck, the condition around the wreck is beyond the ability of inexperienced divers. You must be skilled and well-equipped to dive it. Its depth, water temperature, and currents make it impossible for recreational divers to dive there. You need mixed gases and stage decompression when going for your dive at the Andrea Doria shipwreck. Richard Roost was just 12 years old when his parents took him to Gettysburg. At the popular Civil War battlefield in Gettysburg, Richard was there taking photographs of the grave sites. He spent many hours taking photographs of tombstones. He was fascinated with the gravestones. This even showed up in his drafted will in 1981 when he turned 29 years old. He instructed that within 6 months of his death, an above-ground grave marker of not less than 24 inches in height must be erected. Still, at the same age, Richard was the youngest Eagle Scout in his district. Also, he won the state championship award in field archery. He slammed the bullseye at 50 yards. He continued this way as he grew up. Even his father, Richard Roost Sr., said that he put all his effort into anything he desired. He worked for about 11 years for a Goodyear garage in Ann Arbor, which is across the street from a scuba shop. After snorkeling in Cancun, Richard became a customer at the scuba shop in the late 1970s and bought the shop in 1985. Richard became obsessed with diving ever since. He explored many of the shipwrecks at the bottom of Lake Huron. He spent the month of August together with his friends at the Isle Royale National Park in Lake Superior, near the border with Canada. Many times he assisted police divers in searching for people who were missing in the water. This made his name appear in the Detroit area newspapers. He is very popular among the divers in Michigan. He met his second wife, Cindy, during one of his dives, and they spent their few years of marriage diving together. They divorced after 4 years of marriage in 1996, though they still communicated frequently. On July 6, 1998, Richard had about a 14-hour drive at night from Michigan to eastern Long Island. He placed a phone call to his friend Scott Campbell to inform him about his diving adventure to the Andrea Doria shipwreck. That's how the jolly friends have always been, telling each other about their vacation whenever they couldn't go together. Richard had informed many close friends of his desire to enjoy his diving adventures and stay away from his busy dive shops. But his first target was the Andrea Doria shipwreck. On the Seeker, the ship Richard had boarded for his adventure, he and many other divers were on board for a diving adventure. Richard was with his laptop computer, which he used to construct his dive plans. He considered the gases he would encounter and the depth he planned to go. He was also with a toted color printer. Many people on board saw Richard as a very quiet man. Richard came prepared and determined to at last dive into the Andrea Doria and return to the surface with a first-class china as evidence of his exploit. Though he had planned to dive into the wreck a year before, he was stopped by the bad weather conditions. So this time around, Richard was anxious to see Doria. Dan Crowell, the captain of the Seeker ship, had given him the plans for the decks of the Andrea Doria. He had studied before his trip to the location. To Richard, diving into the Andrea Doria is a life-fulfilling experience. "When I dive the Doria, my life will be complete," he said. He was that passionate about the Andrea Doria shipwreck. No wonder he was nicknamed the Scuba God. Crowell addressed all the divers on safety that early morning. He also told them to make sure they get familiar with the hull of the Andrea Doria before entering it, so all of them agreed to that. He also recommended an introductory swim along the promenade deck of the ship as their first dive. Richard and two other first-timers at the Doria, Joseph Gaddy and Robert Ryan, all made their first dive to the Andrea Doria along the promenade deck, but they returned to the ship within a short time. Richard sat in the Seeker to refill his scuba tanks. The following day, he went into the water again at about 7:59 a.m. He dove in, and when he got into Andrea Doria, he found the china closet at the place where Craig Sokola died 2 weeks before. Richard took a cup and 3 saucers. They were first-class china. Then he went to the promenade deck and later returned to the Seeker. He showed Crowell, the captain of the Seeker ship, the china he had recovered from Andrea Doria's china closet. He also told Crowell about the many windows and doorways in the promenade deck, and then it doesn't seem someone could get lost in there. So, on July 8, 1998, Richard Roost and Steve Berman, a diver on board, entered the water just 10 minutes apart. They could both see themselves as they dove down with the anchor line. Richard planned his dive to last 80 minutes, and he was scheduled to return by 2:30 p.m. When it was 2:43 p.m., Jen Samulski, Crowell's friend and business partner who keeps logs for the 16 divers that were on board, marked Richard as overdue. The crew of the Seeker's ship radioed Wahoo, another ship that wasn't far away, to see if Richard was seen on their anchor, but they didn't. Crowell, who was in his carriage, became furious with the situation, so they began to carry out more investigations about Richard's whereabouts. They called the Coast Guard several times. Crowell entered his wheelhouse and was sketching some notes on the search operation plan to be carried out to Andrea Doria to locate Richard. Many people aboard the Seeker were also searching for Richard Berman, who started diving with Richard, said he observed that the gimbal's hole inside the wreck had silted out, and most likely Richard had entered the wreck from there. Richard had told some friends earlier about his desire to look at the swimming pools, which happens to be a place that most first-time divers at the Andrea Doria would love to see. Crowell sought out volunteer divers who would help them search inside the shipwreck. He was able to get a good number of them. The Coast Guard called them at the Seeker to ask about Richard's details, and the information they got was broadcast throughout the boats at sea. At about 6 p.m., a Coast Guard helicopter from Cape Cod patrolled around the wreck, but Richard was still nowhere to be found. At about 6:30 p.m., Crowell made 2 search teams dive into the water to search for Richard. At 7:15 p.m., Gary Gentile sent a white slate to those on the surface which read, "No sign of body in pool or Gibbel's hole. No sign anywhere. Gary." It was not until after 3 hours that they called Richard's father, Richard Roost Sr. He first thought it was a joke, but later realized the call was from the Coast Guard, so he went to wake his wife. All through the night, they were waiting to receive calls, but none showed up. The Coast Guard helicopter returned to Cape Cod before 8 p.m. Crowell and other senior divers made a plan for the next day's search, that very night after the previous unsuccessful search. At the dawn of the following day, about 5:15 a.m., the Coast Guard sent off the same helicopter to continue the search. But after 2 hours, the helicopter was called for emergency rescue. Only Seeker was left alone to continue the search. Dan Crowell and Greg Mossfelt, a Canadian diver, entered the water at about 9:37 a.m. They entered Andrea Doria and searched through the kitchen that was on the foyer deck, the stairways, and the dining rooms. Still, at 10:31 a.m., they had not found Richard. There are no traces of him at all. Other divers that entered the water searched through the cargo cranes and the debris that had spread out close to the ship. A portion of Andrea Doria's chimney rose from the bottom like a monument in a cemetery. The 15 men that searched for Richard that morning didn't see anything other than the strobe light Richard clipped to the base of the Seeker's anchor line before he entered the wreck. It was at noontime that John Moyer and Gary Gentile dived into the water and entered the promenade deck. Richard had earlier told his friend that it seemed impossible to get lost on this deck. Both were key divers for Andrea Doria. Gentile made his first dive into the wreck about 25 years ago. Moyer had 16 years of experience with Andrea Doria. He led the exploration team that found Andrea Doria's auxiliary bell in 1985. The two divers entered the wreck by the cabin-class ballroom. It was at this point that they found Richard's body wedged between two tables at 210 feet underwater. A prominent scuba diver lost his life diving the famous Andrea Doria. Was this a worthy exploit? Is Andrea Doria worth risking one's life for? Let us know in the comments. We would like to thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed watching, take a dive on the like and subscribe buttons and hit the bell icon so you get notified when we come back with another exciting cave diving story.